Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'd like to sort of just talk about a couple of issues relating to social media and policies being introduced in regard to that, with line 2 tackling terrorism and separately tackling extremism, and really just to try and walk through sort of some of the issues with those and what the consequences of sort of some of the government's proposals might be, and maybe sort of highlighting what I think some of the risks are. Because I think sort of on these issues, the government has an occasionally confused approach to how it regards social media. The head of MI5 not all that long ago, earlier this year, sort of referred to Facebook and Twitter and other social networks as command and control centres for terrorism, sort of related quite hyperbolically difficult sort of speech. And I think sort of at the core of that is the fact that terror groups have shown themselves to be very, very effective at using social media to put out messages, to put out videos, to put out sort of related content. There's also a strong impression that it's used for recruitment, although that's actually much less well evidenced, I think. But I think sort of when you start looking at that, you have to look at what action is already being taken, and to an extent recognise that Britain is one country in the middle of large international social networks. And most of this content and most of these people are not hosting from within Britain. And so for the UK to try and tackle it on its own is not really going to be very effective. The sites already have policies against particularly violent or particularly extreme content and illegal accounts. As it's very easy to create a new account, it's quite difficult to see in those terms how much more realistically the networks could do, and how much more, even if there were more, the British government could make from it. The other thing in the UK context to remember is, of course, online law is offline law. It is just as illegal to incite to racial hatred or religious hatred on Twitter as it would be to do in this room. And so the question of whether you really need special legislation or more than that is, I think, quite an open one. Because the UK is pretty regulated when it comes to speech, when it comes to inciting terror, when it comes to racism, when it comes to other forms of hate speech. We don't have a First Amendment, we have criminal offences, and they can be and are on occasion applied to social media. Which gets us into quite thorny territory of what's being proposed in the new counter-extremism legislation, which has of course already been mentioned. And the specific sort of new proposal on social media would be social media bans for what has been called extremist preachers. Now I think it starts to get the government into very difficult territory in terms of what it's trying to do. Because of course, to create this ban, to create this offence, they have all the difficulties of trying to link an account to an individual. If they deem someone to be an extremist preacher, would it be a criminal offence for them to tweet something themselves? What about if someone else hears them say it and tweets it, quoting them? What if someone else starts an account in that person's name and tweets the content? At what point are the last two legal, the first one not? In what sense is that enforceable? What about people outside the UK? Do you have a situation where the UK and France are the closest point is 15 miles away? Is it the case that someone in France posting content is completely fine, but someone in England would face prison or would face sort of bans from the internet for the same action? And so that's just the enforceability side, and then you come towards the advisability. And it is already illegal to incite terror, to engage in religious or racial hatred, and to do a number of other things. So what is being described as extremist content? Is it just views which would be unpalatable to sort of mainstream Muslims, to mainstream Britons, to, is it a reasonable person test? And at at what point is distasteful speech being criminalised? And that gets into very, very thorny areas where, unless the government has very clear rationales and some very clear definitions, I think there are quite dramatic risks of sort of alienating quite mainstream opinion and criminalising dissent, essentially. On a broader point with social media, you'd also have to question, can the government actually demonstrate a good use of those resources? Is it the case that if someone reads quite radical or what I class as quite extremist views, is that really the mechanism to them becoming a violent terrorist versus perhaps some others with views that people in this room might not like? And I think that's an open question that should be really looked at before these kinds of quite serious policy measures are put in. The last step, I feel like I'm coming up on 10 minutes, would be the question of, I'm a journalist who's got surveillance a lot, and one of the phrases we always hear with regards to communications of crime groups or terror groups is going dark, and that's a phrase that security services use essentially to refer to people who used to communicate in a way an agency would intercept, going to an encrypted service or a secret service or using a dark net. We at Guardian and Edward Snowden got a lot of flack for causing this. And I think there's a broader issue with this in terms of communications. I think, we often hear about integration as being important in sort of, for all sorts of reasons, but including preventing extremism. A lot of people aren't integrated in their physical communities, their areas are overwhelmingly of one ethnicity, their schools are. Social media at the moment is an integrated place. If mainstream Muslims, if young Muslims don't feel like social media, the main networks, are a safe space, they're likely to retreat to other social networks, to other groups, where we're less integrated and perhaps there's actually a greater radicalisation risk. And so part of these policies and these ideas and the way the government tries to sort of form an agenda on social media really has to tackle that issue too, and looking at the benefits that being on the same networks and sort of feeling safe to use those networks, as Muslim as anyone, I think is just as important as the rest. And I think the lack of a positive social media strategy is actually probably as much of a problem as the existence of perhaps some of the difficult clauses in the counter-extremism bill. I hope that's useful. Thank you.